Would you address that?
Okay, one section of the Jewish establishment uses the Holocaust as a vehicle for support for the state of Israel. You know, we will never survive as a people unless we have an independent nation, and you know, here we are, and this is what happened to us. Now, they also use it to beat people over the head with, you know, every time that you mention something that Israel does that you don't like, you're an anti-Semite. Wow. An anti-Semite is anybody that the Jews say is an anti-Semite. That's the only definition I can come up with. What else can I say? Okay, the very first time that I became aware of the fact that there was any kind of problem between the Ukrainians and the Jews, I was a school counselor in an inner city in Chicago, and the psychologist that used to come by and test the kids once a week, you know, these are youngsters that I would recommend, or some of the teachers would recommend for further testing. He happened to be Jewish. And over the year, we got to be very friendly. And the summer was coming. I said to him, what are you going to do this summer? He says, well, I'm going to be working at a Jewish youth camp. And I said, really? I said, that's wonderful, because I'm going to be working at a Ukrainian youth camp. And he looked at me with this startled look. He said, you're Ukrainian? I said, yeah. He said, oh. I said, why the oh? And he said, well, you know, it's got nothing to do with you, but you must understand, my family, I've been brought up not to like Ukrainians. I said, why? He said, well, my grandmother always used to tell the story of how the Ukrainian army marched into Minsk, and she was hiding in the basement, and the Ukrainian army was killing Jews. I said, Minsk? I said, Minsk is not in Ukraine. I said, the Ukrainian army was nowhere near Minsk. Well, he said, that's not possible. I said, well, it is. I said, whoever told you that story, I know you like your grandmother and all of that. I said, but she was wrong. Minsk is not in Ukraine. It's in Belarus. Well, he said, let me look into that. So he did. You know, the following week he came and, you know, he said, yeah, well, I guess it is. I says, well, look on a map. You don't have to go any further than that. Yeah, and so that was the first time that I heard about it, that there were any kind of major issues. Then later on, I became more familiar with the issues, and I asked people who were more familiar than I was at the time, and I was given this book called Ukrainians and Jews, a Symposium, and it was published by the Ukrainian Congress Committee, and it basically outlined all the major issues, one of which was the idea that Jews do not like Ukrainians because of what they believe about certain Ukrainian heroes, our heroes, one of whom is Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who, in our eyes, was a liberator. He killed many Jews, no question about that, but he also killed many Poles and Ukrainian Catholic priests, okay? So it wasn't just that he was focusing on Jews. But that aside, the second terrible person in their eyes is a man by the name of Simon Petlura. Okay? Here's a book about him written by a Jew. Okay? It's called Pohromchik, and it's written by a professor, associate professor of Near Eastern and Jewish history at Youngstown State University. This is an old book. And basically what it is the story of the assassination of Simon Petlura. Now, Simon Petlura, you should understand, was the ruler of Ukraine after the fall of the Russian Empire. There were approximately 4 years during which Ukrainians were free, from approximately 1917 to 1921-22. And during that time, we had one ruler who was named Hrushevsky, Mikhailo Hrushevsky. He was the president. He was a socialist. He was replaced when the Germans came in, and they appointed a Pavlo Skoropadsky, who was a hetman, who traced his family heritage to the Ukrainian Cossacks. He was replaced after the Germans retreated by Simon Petlura. Now, the White Russian Army under Denikin was committing various anti-Semitic acts, mass murder of Jews, no question of that. And Ukrainians under the leadership of an anarchist by the name of Machno were also committing anti-Jewish acts, murder, mass murder. Simon Petlura issued an order to the Ukrainian army in which he said all anti-Semitic acts, all the killing of Jews which is going on, is subject to criminal prosecution. Any soldier found doing that. By that time, there was such chaos in Ukraine that basically Petlura had no control. Now, I should mention to you that during the days of the first Ukrainian Republic, the Ukrainians had money that was printed in 4 different languages, one of which was Hebrew, one of which was Ukrainian, one of which was Polish, and one of which was Russian. And again, there were many Jews who were in Petlura's cabinet, who were Jewish. They were very much in favor of a Ukrainian independent state. But the myth of Petlura as a pogromist lived on after the war. And a Jew by the name of Schwarzbart, who came from the Soviet Union, assassinated Petlura in Paris after the war, and became a Jewish hero. And this is the story of the trial that was held in Paris. And even though he admitted shooting Simon Petlura, the French courts let him go. And Schwarzbart lived down to a ripe old age. So, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Simon Petlura are the 2 arch enemies of the Jewish people. They put both of them on a par with Adolf Hitler. It's just unbelievable. Now, Ukrainians have over the years tried to ameliorate whatever bad feelings there were, but the Jews went through the motions, and that was it. Actually got nowhere. The last example that I'm going to give you of a dialogue, which I started after Ivan Demjanjuk, who was just tried in Germany. It was his third trial. The first one was in Ohio. The second one was in Israel. And the third one just ended. Now, in order to give you some background, we have to talk about the Office of Special Investigations. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it is a part of the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, okay? Office of Special Investigations. It was organized by Jewish congressmen, specifically Elizabeth Holtzman. It is funded by the U.S. government, and it has as its sole purpose the search for Nazis living in the United States. Now, they started after a number of Lithuanians. The first big case they had was against Wallace, Fred Wallace, I think that's his first name, I'm not sure, W-A-L-U-S. And as it turned out, he was not their guy, and he wasn't who they thought he was, so they made a big boo-boo. And then they found a guy by the name of John Demjanjuk, Ivan the Terrible. He was actually called by OSI. And they started to go after him. And he's a former worker, he's a laborer, he's a blue-collar guy, worked in an automobile plant in Ohio, and lived in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. He maintained that he was innocent. And I didn't know if he was innocent or not, but a woman for whom I have a lot of respect by the name of Bożena Olszeniewska called me up one day and she said, look, it looks like they're going to extradite him to the state of Israel. And he's got no defense, because in Israel, they do not provide for a defense attorney. So, you know, we have to raise money. So it was an international campaign. I went from city to city. I mean, maybe one or two cities. Actually, it wasn't as if I was on a tour or anything, but it was one or two cities, and I raised money for his defense. In North America, the Ukrainian Americans and the Ukrainian Canadians raised over $1 million for his defense, right? He maintained all along that he was not Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. What really got me more interested was the fact that the head of OSI at that time, a man by the name of Alan Ryan, published a book called The Nazis Next Door. And basically he said that there were 10,000 of them at least living in the United States, had been let in under the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. And the job of OSI was to find them and bring them to justice. Well, one of those people was my wife. I'm thinking, wait a minute, I know the history of the Displaced Persons Act. I mean, these people went through all kinds of investigations. They were not 10,000 Nazis, come on. So that, more than anything else, convinced me that this was all a big scam. So I started to raise money. And we raised over $1 million, as I mentioned. And John Demjanjuk went to Israel, was convicted. The Israelis in the courtroom were dancing around going, kill, kill, kill. Kill John Demjanjuk. Kill all Ukrainians. Just jumping up and down. Well, What's this all about? So, to their credit, the lawyer for John Demjanjuk went to the Supreme Court on appeal, and just as the appeal was going through, the Soviet Union fell apart. Now, mind you, all the evidence against John, and this was the third reason that I thought that this was a scam, was that all the evidence against John Demjanjuk was based on an identity card which was supplied by the Soviets, okay? And all the names of all the Ukrainians who had been so-called Nazis were supplied by the Soviets. So this was the third reason why I thought, now this is really something very, very fishy, knowing how the Soviets operate and knowing how the Soviets disliked Ukrainians here, those who were for an independent, anti-Soviet Ukrainian republic. So, the Soviet Union falls apart. Yoram Sheftel, who is the attorney, travels to Ukraine, rifles through the Soviet files, and discovered that they had the wrong guy. Now, mind you, in Israel there were 5 witnesses who said, yeah, that's him, that's the guy. It turns out that it wasn't John Demjanjuk. There was a guy by the name of Marchenko. To the eternal credit of the Israelis, even though he spent 5 years in Israel, 3 years in the death cell, okay, waiting to be hanged, they let him go. He comes back to the United States. Looks really bad for OSI because, again, here's another error, another boo-boo. He wasn't who they said they were. Well, now, OSI needs to save face. So what do? They decide that they have to talk another country into having another trial, because if he wasn't Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, he had to be Ivan the Very Bad somewhere else. So they found a place called Sobibor, which is another camp of murdering Jews. So they went to Poland and they said, look, this camp is in your area. You have to try him for war crimes. And the Poles, to their credit, said, okay, we will, if you will help us to get another war criminal. They said, what war criminal? I said, one living in Israel who killed Poles after World War II. What's his name? They gave him the name. Well, he's too old. It was written about in a book called An Eye for an Eye. And the Jews said, well, he's too old, we can't let him go. So the Poles said, no deal. So then they went to an independent state of Ukraine. And they said, would you try him? Well, we'll have to investigate. So that was dragging on. So OSI went to Germany. And they said to the Germans, everybody thinks that it's just the Germans that were involved in the Holocaust. But the Holocaust could never have happened had it not been for helpers like Lithuanians, Latvians, and especially the Ukrainians. Well, perfect. So the Germans, in order to save face for themselves, it was a perfect deal. So they took Ivan and they tried him. There were no witnesses. The only evidence was the identity card that said that he had been at Trauniki, which was the training camp for the guards who worked at these various death camps. The only problem was that the same card that they used in Israel, which many experts said was a fake, they used again 2 weeks before the trial ends. The FBI finally gets around to saying, yeah, it is a fake. The German court said it doesn't make any difference. No identity card, no witnesses. He's still an accessory to the death of 27,000 people at Sobibor. and they rewrote German law on the spot in order to make allowances for this one Ukrainian, okay? Even though there were still Nazis alive today in Germany who were more guilty than Ivan, even if he was a guard, okay? And we'll never know for sure, I don't think. But even if he was a guard, there were people who were in charge of the camp at Sobibor who were let go. So, realizing this, I had been involved with the Jews since the 1970s. And the reason I was involved was the 1970s in the United States was called the Year of the Ethnic. It was when, quote, white ethnics were going to come into their own. Why? Because, yeah, okay, yes, my wife just reminded me that witnesses looked at the photos prior to the Israeli trial and said, yes, that was him. But then they found out that when they laid out the photos, the photo of John Demjanjuk was the largest one. So these witnesses, after 40, 50 years, say, oh, that's him, that's him. Okay, so thank you very much, honey. So anyway, I had been involved with the Jews since the 1970s, and we had organized, with the help of the American Jewish Committee, something called the Illinois Consultation on Ethnicity. And we were talking about how to preserve the ethnic heritage, how to preserve the language schools that we had, how to be Americans plus. It wasn't multiculturalism, it was cultural pluralism, okay? It was, we are Americans plus, we're Americans first, but we happen to be of Ukrainian background, a Polish background. And so this is what we were, you know, working on, and I became very close to a gentleman by the name of David Roth, who worked for the American Jewish Committee. And he asked me to serve on the ethnic consultation. And I said, but I'm a Ukrainian, you're Jewish, and you're asking me? He says, yeah. I said, well, you don't know your Jewish history, do you? He said, what's the difference? I said, great. So we became very close. Our families became close. It was a wonderful thing. When the Demjanjuk thing began to open up, I said to him, look, I said, there are a lot of Ukrainians that are very upset. They said, OSI only has the Jews working for them, with the exception of Alan Ryan. All the historians, all the people, most of the people who work for OSI are Jewish. And I says they have no credibility in our Ukrainian community. I said it would be nice if they would hire a Ukrainian lawyer. And if these people are guilty, if Demjanjuk is a mass murderer, then he should be punished, I agree. But given our histories, the Ukrainians have little faith in OSI. He says, you're right. So he said, why don't we start a Ukrainian-Jewish dialogue? I said, fine. So we went to the president of the American Jewish Committee in Chicago. We started a dialogue, Ukrainian-Jewish dialogue specifically, okay? And David even went as far, he says, you know, you make a very good point about John. He says, why don't you fly to American Jewish Committee headquarters in New York and talk to the leadership there? Present your case. I said, okay, you know, that's wonderful. So I flew to New York. I presented my case. The first person to answer was a Jewish woman sitting right in the front seat. And she said, I say hooray for the OSI. I say kill Demjanjuk. He's a Nazi. I said, first of all, I told you he can't be a Nazi. To be a Nazi, you had to be an Aryan. Only Aryans could belong to the Nazi party. This guy's a Ukrainian. He was Untermensch. Understand that. Hooray for OSI. And everybody else kind of, looked down and murmured and said, Myron, you have to understand how the Jewish people feel. I said, wait a minute. Why is it that I always have to understand how the Jewish people feel, but you people never want to understand how the Ukrainian people feel? Well, yeah, but, we went through the Holocaust. I said, that's always the elephant in the room. The Holocaust, it's always looking over our shoulder, and it's always that we're on the defensive. We have to defend ourselves because... Anyway, it didn't go well. And the Jewish dialogue went on and on and on. And then in 1990, there were rumors that the Soviet Union was falling apart. Well, actually, it was 1988, 89, but in 89, the Soviet Union was still in existence. And the topic in our dialogue turned to whether or not Ukraine was going to become an independent state. And I said, absolutely, it will. If the Soviet Union falls apart, Ukraine will declare its independence, even though George H.W. Bush went to Kiev and said, don't stick it out with the Russians, don't do anything stupid. But the Ukrainians, thank God, didn't listen to George H.W. But in 1989, it was still Soviet Ukraine. And they said to me, an independent Ukraine makes us feel uneasy. I said, why? He said, well, because of the pogroms. I said, what pogroms? Well, the history. I said, you have to understand it. Will you stop telling me that I have to understand? I do understand. But you have to understand us. Again, okay, this is what this whole dialogue is about. Where are they going to be, the pogroms? We know. And I said, how do you know? He said, well, we have contacts in Ukraine, Jews. I said, you know what? I said, it just so happens that next month I'm going to Ukraine. I've been invited by a professor at the University of Kiev to come to his classes in political science and to his law students and to talk about the Ukrainian immigration, which is my area of expertise. And I said, and I'm going to be in Kiev. And I said, why don't you give me the name of your man or your person in Kiev who will tell me about these pogroms. And as you know, I write a column for the Ukrainian Weekly, and if he tells me that there are going to be pogroms, that I'll write about it in the Ukrainian Weekly, because this is unconscionable that the Ukrainians should do anything so absolutely horrendous. They said, good. So they gave me the name of a gentleman by the name of Mark Courtyard. They gave me his phone number. They said, okay, this is the guy. I said, you sure this is your guy? Right, it's our guy. So I get to Kiev, I call him up. I said, hi, Mark. I speak to him in Ukrainian. I explained that we have a Ukrainian-Jewish dialogue. Oh, he said, you're from Chicago. I said, yes. He says, I speak English. Oh, I said, perfect. You speak English. He says, I'll come to your room in the hotel. I'm sorry. Okay. So, so I get to Kiev, I phone him up, and he comes. And I said, do you mind if I record you? He says, not at all. So he identifies himself, who he is, Mark Kotlan, and he's been active in the Jewish community and the like. And he's a refusnik. He says, I want to leave here. I want to go to the United States eventually. First question, I said, we've heard from our Jewish partners in the Ukrainian-Jewish dialogue that the Ukrainians are preparing for a pogrom. He says, that's outrageous. He said, absolute nonsense. He said, if there are going to be any pogroms, it'll be in Russia, he says, and Jewish families are sending their children to Jewish relatives in Ukraine for safekeeping in anticipation of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Whoa, I said, that's fantastic. He said, not only that, he says, all the Jews that I know that are active, that are visible, are for an independent Ukrainian state. In fact, tomorrow, you'll have a chance to meet them. Well, I said, great. So I go out the next day, interview some of them. Yeah, in Ukrainian, they tell me, no, we're for an independent Ukraine. No pogroms, forget pogroms. Then the next thing I know, one of them says, well, you know, we've had a number of Jews from America who have come here and have told us about the pogroms. We never knew about them. Oh, I said, really? I said, well, what have you heard? Well, you know, we weren't taught much of the history, so now we're becoming aware of the pogroms. Oh, I said, okay. So the next thing I know, I come back to the United States, put the tape recorder on the table, press the button, sit back and listen. And as I'm looking around at our Jewish partners, they're fidgeting. First thing out of one of their mouths was, are you sure? I said, well, no. I said, don't even start with, are you sure? That's Mark Kortler. He identified himself. He said who he was. It's your Jew, not mine. That's the person you told me to contact. I didn't know the guy from Adam. Well, yeah, but, you know, I said, no, I don't want to, yeah, but. So I said, okay, that's, okay, why don't we just leave it at that? I walked out of the room. They walked out of the room. A few months later, I learned that Mark Kortler is in Los Angeles. Happened to get his phone number. Call him up. Mark, how you doing? You remember me? Yeah. I said, well, since you know what it's all about, I said, are you ever going to be in Chicago? He says, I'll be there next month. Wow. I said, unbelievable. I said, would you meet with our group? He said, absolutely, no problem. So I call everybody up from our group and from their group, and we rent out a restaurant for a Monday night, okay? Rent out a whole restaurant just for the dialogue group. He comes in, and he talks to them in fluent English. And they ask him hostile questions. They begin very, very hostile. And I'm sitting there going, what is it with these people? So then, we had organized right across the street in the Ukrainian Cultural Center for Mark Kortler to meet with members of the Ukrainian community, packed the hall. And I said to the Jewish partners, I said, okay, now, I said, what we're going to do, we're going to go across the street and you're going to meet some Ukrainian anti-Semites. Well, what do you mean? I said, you're going to meet anti-Semites? I said, I packed the whole hall full of them. So we walk across the street and they're going, well, you know, what's this? I said, just come, just, work with me here. Walked across the street, walk in, and Mark Kortler, to his credit, in Ukrainian says, glory to Ukraine. I thought the roof was going to fall out. People are crying and clapping and singing, and it's just wonderful. And he spoke to them. He said, look, I love Ukraine. He said, I love the Ukrainian people. Are there anti-Semites? Yeah, here and there. They're idiots. He said, but most Ukrainians that I've ever known got along with Jews. In fact, the Jews are supporting Ukrainian independence, okay? So after that experience, I said to our Jewish partners, end of dialogue. I said, if after all of that, after you're knowing me for 20 years, after you gave me this wonderful certificate, okay, after all of that, you still have no faith in me and what I've said about my people, I'm done. I'm out of here. Now, I'll tell you one other thing that happened. As part of the earlier ethnic consultation, David Roth organized a trip to Israel for all of us. So there were Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Mexicans, and Japanese that were part of this group that went compliments of the American Jewish committee. We went to Israel. And David Roth went out of his way to find Jews who were emigres from Ukraine. Now, this is about maybe early 1980s. And he said, I want you to meet some of them. So I meet one guy by the name of Suslinski, all right, whose life had been saved by a Ukrainian in Siberia because he was being beaten up, and the Ukrainian saved his life. From that moment on, he decided that he was going to devote his life to improving relations between Ukrainians and Jews. And they met him in Israel. And they have a Ukrainian-Jewish dialogue group there, okay? I mean, it's Jews from Ukraine, okay? They have a dialogue group, and they work together to improve the relations. I said, well, how do you get along with the Israeli officials? He said, well, he says, they didn't even recognize us until you guys were coming. Then all of a sudden they were looking for us. Oh, you know, the American Jewish Committee wants you, you know. So he said, thank you for the recognition that we got from the government for the first time. Anyway, I said, Yaakov, is there any chance that you could come here? And he says, you know, I'd love to come. I said, we'll pay your way. And you can meet with Jews, the dialogue, you know, group and everything. And he said, fine. He said, I'd like to do that. So he flies to New York. I meet him in New York. He comes to the Ukrainian National Association. We have a great big interview with him. It's all over the Ukrainian press. Yaakov Suslinski from Israel, saved by a Ukrainian, devoting his life to improving Ukrainian Jewish ideas. And he then comes to Chicago, and we organize a big, big reception for him, pack the hall, invite our Jewish dialogue partners to come. This is in the 80s. None of them show up. None of them do. He comes to the hall, he talks to the Ukrainians, he gets a standing ovation, and, you know, everything. They love him. Next day I go to David Roth. He says, what is going on, David? I said, come on. Well, you know, we were busy. I said, I give you a month's notice on this. One of the members from your group would have been there. Well, yeah, but I said, okay. Organize a meeting between Suslinski and the American Defamation League. He says, I will. So we walked into a meeting that they were having. It was a meeting, it was not the ADL, but it was a meeting, I'm trying to remember, of the Jewish umbrella organization that had ADL, AJC, all of the Jewish organizations. The Jewish Federation, the American Jewish Federation of Chicago, okay, was there. Yaakov Suslinski walks in, he's introduced, and he comes to sit. And the woman sitting next to him, just to make sure that we saw that, went just like that. Like, I'm not sitting next to this Jew, okay? I don't want anything to do with this guy. And I thought, well, you dummy, you absolute idiot. So then we went to the local Jewish newspaper. Young Ukrainian, a young Jewish editor of the paper, all right? He's interviewing Yaakov. And he's listening very bored. Yeah, okay. So. First question to Yaakov, without looking at my wife or me. My wife's sitting there, I'm sitting there. And he's looking at Yaakov and he says, tell me, Yaakov, why do you have anything to do with these people? Why? And David Roth is sitting there. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. What do you mean, these people? What are we? What are we, Untermensch? I mean, what is it with you? And So I said, okay, David, I'm out of here. I'm not going to be insulted by this moron. And David said, wait. And I said, no, wait anymore, David. Done. We're not going to be here. We're not going to be embarrassed, okay? So we left. You know, and on the way out, David Roth says, I couldn't believe that. I said, well, now you know, David. Now you know. You've seen it. At the Jewish Federation, you saw it at the Jewish News. Here in town, we had a reception for Yaakov in our house. He was here overnight. In fact, he was here for a whole weekend. And we invited all the local Jews, and they all came. They met him. They're very polite. They're very nice. And they were truly interested in what life was like for Jews in, you know, the Soviet Union. And he told them. And anyway, I've had all of these wonderful experiences. David, unfortunately, died in 1995 of a heart attack. A young man. He was in his, I think, mid-50s at the time. But after he died, that was the end of any contact that both my wife and I had with his wife or with the American Jewish community or with anybody else. So that's my story.
That's a good story. So let me ask you a few things. First of all, OSI. Most Americans haven't a clue what that is.
I know.
Why is it? Why is it so laden? What is the purpose of that? Why should anybody be concerned? Or, you know, what's the issues? What is that thing exist for? Why would anybody care? Why is it important to hunt down Nazis? Who cares about that?
Well, the Jews care about that, okay? And they have, you know, convinced the American government, the U.S. Congress, that it's important to send back all the Nazis. Okay, now I'll tell you something else. I went with a Lithuanian friend of mine. We went to Washington, D.C. We met with the head of OSI at that time. It was a man by the name of Neil Scher. It was during the Reagan administration yet. And the Attorney General was there, and we asked Neil Scher, you know, why don't you have a Ukrainian or a Lithuanian working so that you can get credibility among the Balts and the Ukrainians? And he said, that's really not the issue. I said, what do you mean it's not the issue? He said, we're not interested in credibility among you guys. Oh. I said, you don't want credibility with us guys? We're Americans, Neil, remember? We vote. He said, yeah. And he just, you know, let it fly. So we talked to the Attorney General who was in the room, who felt uncomfortable by what Neil said. And we walked out, you know, and that was it. So it's not as if we didn't try. Now, they keep a very low profile. Every once in a while, you will find something in the New York Times or the Washington Post about OSI and the wonderful work that they're doing in hunting down Nazis that live in the United States. Now, none of them are, quote, Nazis, but it's easier for the press to write Nazis because it's, you know, rather than explain that these people were from countries that were under Nazi occupation, you know, they write, like, for example, the Demjanjuk case was just ended this month, all right? At the beginning of the month, they were writing on last big trial of a Nazi. I mean, they use that term Nazi. So Ukrainian, Nazi, identical terms.
So in reality, what they're after is collaborators?
Yes. You know, absolutely. And among them, are there people who did work with the Nazis and did murder Jews? I think so. And our statement right from the beginning from the Ukrainian Congress Committee was that if there are Ukrainians living in the United States who committed crimes against humanity. We want them punished just as much as anybody else, if not more so, all right? But we cannot tolerate the fact that most of the evidence is from the Soviet Union.
There's again, for the average American doesn't have a clue about any of this. I mean,
Right.
I'm not that much informed, but I know that there were Jewish collaborators of various kinds.
Yes.
There were all sorts of Nazis of all stripes and
There were Jewish couples. Some of them still live in Israel. Tom Segev, S-E-G-E-V, wrote a book called The Seventh Million, in which he wrote about these couples. They found them in Israel, they tried them, and they gave them a suspended sentence because of their age. So there you go.
So from the Ukrainian American perspective, what is this OSI? I mean, it seems like it's again, I mentioned to you the Jewish community has an official representative in the State Department now,
Right.
who I interviewed. So is this another, from the Ukrainian perspective, is this another Jewish group that is doing what? For what purpose? What's the real meaning?
This is an American institution, Office of Special Investigation. It's an American institution, okay, whose purpose it is to find war criminals, okay? And it just so happens that the only people they have focused on have been the Balts and the Ukrainians, okay? Starting with Alan Ryan, who wrote that book. The name of the book is Quiet Neighbors, all right? And basically his whole thesis was that there are 10,000 potential Nazis living next door to you, all right? And thank God for OSI, which is going to find these Nazis, okay? Because they just may reappear someday as your next door neighbor, you know? And so Alan Ryan wrote this book. I read the book. I was sincerely interested. As soon as on page 14 or 15, you know, he starts to write about the Displaced Persons Act. In fact, he says something to the effect, had the United States wanted to bring in Nazi war criminals en masse, they couldn't have done better than with the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. I went, whoa! You know, this is so off the wall. And it was so typical of what the Soviets were saying. The Soviets were angry about Harry Truman signing the Displaced Persons Act because they basically said that every displaced person who fled the workers' paradise of the Soviet Union was a collaborator. It was a collaborator. And they all needed to be returned. And some of them were. Some of the Displaced Persons Act, some of them were returned kicking and screaming under what came to be called Operation Keelhaul, which where they dragged them out of the displaced persons camps, placed them on boxcars, and the boxcars, if you read Solzhenitsyn, went directly to Siberia. So, knowing all of this, and I read this in this stupid book by this moron, Alan Ryan, and I think, whoa, this whole thing is a scam. It's a scam. Now, Alan Ryan was what? He was the front man for the Jews, okay? But after he left, then they got a man by the name of Neil Scher, who after he left OSI, he went to work for a Jewish restitution agency, which is what Finkelstein writes about. Neil Scher, to tell you what kind of a guy he was in terms of his own personal character, he was siphoning money away from the survivors into his own pocket. He was tried for that, and he lost his right to practice law. He was disbarred from practicing law. Neil Scher, S-H-E-R.
Now, isn't he? I have a little familiarity with this from the past. A long time ago, wasn't he connected with AIPAC eventually or something?
He was with them in the beginning, I think, and then he went to OSI, and then after that he went to the Jewish Restitution Organ. I don't know the name of the organization.
So again, for the average person who hasn't a clue and has no interest in all this.
Yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, why would any American?
Well, but in the Ukrainian view, then there's a narrow focus in this OSI group. I mean, could you? I mean, why is it? Why again specifically are the Ukrainians? They're going after. They're very narrow in what they're after, and what's behind that? In your view, why?
Okay.
What's
right.
its mean? What is its meaning?
Well, for the average Ukrainian, it means that what the Soviets have been saying about all Ukrainians who fled, all Ukrainians who fought the Soviets during World War II, all of them were collaborators. And what this does, what the Demjanjuk case were, and all of them were anti-Semitic. I mean, there was nobody more anti-Semitic, but maybe Adolf Hitler, but certainly Joseph Stalin and those around him did not like Jews. I mean, they weren't as bad as Hitler, obviously, but they did not like the Jews. So what the Jews have done, they have published tons of books in the English language. I mean, not the Jews, Soviets. They flooded the American market with books about Ukrainian nationalist Nazi collaborators, okay? Now, plus, we had what we called UPA, which is the Ukrainska Повстанська Armia, which was the underground army which fought both the Soviets and the Germans in World War II, all right? And lasted until about 1953, 1954, that late, before the Soviets were able to wipe them out. Now, it is in the Soviet interest to, in fact, push the idea that we were Nazis. Plus, I did research, and I showed you the book downstairs called Sabotage, the Secret War. Many of the communists, far out of proportion to their number in the United States, many of the early communists were Jews. Many of the early communists were also Russians and Ukrainians and every other ethnic group. They had been enticed to become members of the Socialist Federation that was organized at the time. But far out of their number, far out of proportion to their number, many of the American communists were Jews, all right? Now, the same was true in the Soviet Union, in the beginning at least. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Kaganovich, Sverdlov, the early Bolsheviks were communists, okay? And by constantly pointing to Nazis, it's very interesting. They never say Nazis because Nazi stands for National Socialists, okay? What they say, what the Soviets have always said, is fascists. Well, Hitler wasn't, he liked Mussolini, but he was not a fascist. He was a National Socialist, okay? But if the Soviets had ever said we're fighting National Socialism, then that's a bad reflection on their own Soviet Socialist republics, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Then that's my take on that. You know, I don't know, but that's, I mean, it makes sense. Anyway, the Soviets flooded the market here in the United States. Not that anybody read anything they wrote, but the average American. But panicked the average Ukrainian. And during World War II, the Ukrainian Communist Party in the United States was very powerful. It was, I mean, there were hundreds of Ukrainians who were members of the Communist Party. And what they were saying was, wait. As soon as the war is over, the United States, which was allied with Joseph Stalin, is going to take all of you Ukrainian nationalists and send you over to the Soviet Union for trials against the Soviet people. And the Ukrainian immigrants who didn't know any better were scared, were frightened. So what the Soviets are trying to do is to set the stage for the fact to discredit Ukrainian nationalism. And the Jews were the perfect foil for that, the perfect foil. Because Jews had a tendency to kind of lean towards the left anyway. And so they had a working relationship. So they would go to the Soviet Union and ask for their list of communists, and the Soviets were more than happy to oblige and say, yeah, these are all the people that we know that are Nazi war criminals.
Okay, you've touched on a few things. The issue of Jewish representation in the Soviet apparatus, this comes up a lot. And I've talked to some other scholars who've discussed it, but it's also a taboo.
Oh, I know.
I mean, could you address that? But that's one of you're attacked as an anti-Semite for just saying that.
I know.
There's a lot. I talked to John Mearsheimer, talked about the Jewish profound presence in the archipelago, the Soviet archipelago, the Gulag.
Yeah, good.
And Solzhenitsyn supposedly wrote about it. That book has never been in English, and all this. But there's all this stuff, and it's basically a very censored and delicate area. Could you? And it applies to the Ukrainian issue quite a bit.
Okay. Personally, here's what I think. I have no documentation, but here's what I think. It is to the advantage of the Jews to constantly point to Nazis, to the Holocaust, because it takes the spotlight off of their involvement in the Holodomor, in the Soviet Union, because the minute you say, well, what about Jewish involvement in the Holodomor? Oh, what are you talking about? What are you, an anti-Semite? This is perfect for them. They have the best of all possible worlds. If you criticize Jews, but in fact, if you criticize Israel, I don't criticize Israel. I like Israel. I admire them because they are Jewish nationalists, and I'm a Ukrainian nationalist, and I can relate to them, okay? But it's the Jews in the United States, Anti-Defamation League, mainly the Anti-Defamation League, who is in the forefront of this idea to constantly push for looking for Nazi war criminals in order to raise money. But as Finkelstein has wrote, the money doesn't go to the survivors. It goes to the ADF and, the ADL and other organizations like that.
Okay, you brought up, I guess this is a good segue to talk about the Holodomor. Most Americans, I haven't a clue about this, and nobody, and could you address all this, what exactly that is, why the Jewish angle to this is controversial, and why the Holocaust is so well known by every school kid around, yet the Holodomor was at least as grievous, it appears. And could you address the whole can of worms of what all that is?
All right.
Big issue.
I want to tell you that in the beginning, Holodomor was a plan devised by Joseph Stalin to first of all organize collective farms, to destroy the independent farmer. Because if you had an independent farmer, he was going to sell his produce for the best price. Okay, and this was not in keeping with the Soviet ideal. This was capitalism. This had to be destroyed. So what they did, they formed collective farms. So this was the first step. This was starting about 1920. 28, 29, 30. We started to organize these, okay. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Union was running out of money. They had sold off many of the Romanov jewels and all the gold from the cathedrals and all the churches and all of that. And they were literally running out of money. So what was the one thing that they could still sell in the world market in order to get money, in order to build up an industrial base? Wheat. Where was wheat? It was in Ukraine. So now that you have these collective farms, you create a quota. Each collective farm has to give so much wheat to the government, all right? Well, 1930, 1931, 32, between 32 and 33, they reached the point where they wanted all the wheat, all the wheat. And the Ukrainians started to starve to death, and they began to flee. The Soviets put up soldiers all around the border of Ukraine, gave everybody a passport. If you left without a passport and were found outside of Ukraine, you were shot. Okay, so there was a tremendous starvation campaign aimed at two things. One, to get the wheat to sell on the market. Ukrainians living outside of Ukraine, especially in Poland, which was right over the border, learned about the famine. And they let the rest of the Ukrainians of the world know. And the Ukrainians began marches in Philadelphia and Chicago and Detroit, marching against the famine. In the meantime, the Moscow correspondent for the New York Times, a gentleman by the name of Walter Duranty, went to Ukraine, saw all the starvation. Last year, would you get that? Yeah. Saw all the starvation, saw all the people dying, and wrote in the New York Times that there was no famine, for which he received the Pulitzer Prize.
Can we wait 1 second?
Sure. Who?
Gloria Cooper? Do you know it?
No.
No, all right, forget it.
Hello?
Stop.
Oh, okay, well, why don't we?
Stop, it can't be that important.
Okay. Anyway, so the Soviets mounted an enormous cover-up of this. And a number of reporters, Walter Duranty and others, okay? The only one, well, there were actually two. It was the reporter for the Herald American, trying to think of his name right offhand, and Malcolm Muggeridge, who wrote about this. And they were vilified by the New York Times and other newspapers, okay, saying that this is anti-Soviet propaganda. Now, in the Roosevelt White House, there were Soviet agents. It all has come out very recently, after they were able to publish some of the information that the Americans already had during World War II about the spy network in the United States. You know, Alger Hiss and others. And Roosevelt was surrounded by people of the left or communist agents. And it all just went along with the idea that we just have to get along with the Soviets, and if we do what Stalin asked, everything's going to be fine. I needed our name. Because Rus, R-U-S, was the name of an empire that stretched all the way from the Black Sea north to the Baltic. Huge empire, which received its Christianity from Byzantium, from the Greeks, in 988. Okay, and it was called Rus. And the roots of the so-called, quote, Russian identity traced back to two cities, Muscovy and Suzdal, which are in the north. And Muscovy was constantly moving in an imperial manner towards the west. And eventually began to attack Rush, right? And in fact, under Andrei Boholutsky, sacked the capital of Rush, which was Kiev, right? Now, it was, and then they eventually occupied all of Ukraine after 1654, right? There was an agreement reached between Bogdan Khmelnytsky and the Tsar of Russia. And the Tsar of Russia said, you know, why don't you let us station our troops as a protection against the Poles? And Khmelnytsky, in his ignorance, naivete, said, okay. And of course the Russians never left. But it was not until the time of Peter the Great that the Muscovites began to call themselves Russians. There is no name for Russian in the Ukrainian language. We always call them Moskali. Moskali meant Muscovites, the people from Moscow. It's only within the last 100 years that the Ukrainian people began to call them Rusiane, which meant Russians, okay? But now, it was to the advantage of the Russians to always consider Ukraine part of Mother Russia. After the collapse of the Russian Empire, the American universities suddenly took an interest in Russia because now you had the communists, now you had the Soviet Union, and who are these people? Who are the Russians? There were no Russian studies departments anywhere practically of any significance in the United States. But guess what? Suddenly we have all of these Russian immigrants, Russian Tsarist immigrants, Russian Tsarist professors fleeing the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden Harvard and Columbia and Yale said, would you like to work here and develop a Russian studies department? Yeah, duh, why not? So they did. And they trained 2 generations of American scholars, Russian scholars, to take on the Russian concept of history, which said that Ukraine has always been part of Russia, and Kiev was the mother of all Russian cities. Oh yes, never was, okay? Moscow was the mother of all Russian cities. Novgorod may have been the mother of all Russian cities, but certainly not Kiev.
Okay. I want to refocus on the Holodomor.
Holodomor,
And
okay.
especially a lot of things, but especially the controversial issue, that the Jewish angle to that.
Okay,
And that's controversial as hell.
okay. But let me just tell you why people don't know about it, okay?
Yeah, that's also an issue, yeah.
All right, okay. Here's an article, this goes back many, many years. This goes back to '83 on the 50th anniversary of the Holodomor. The Ukrainian National Association published just this little book, and I wrote an article in it calling it America's Red Decade, which is the 1930s, and the Great Famine Cover-Up. Now, I write about the Red Decade and how the press corps concealed the famine. It was Walter Duranty and a number of other reporters such as Eugene Lyons before he realized what the Soviet Union was all about. All right? I'm just thinking,
Could you show me a shot? Could I see the cover of that, please?
sure.
And may I ask you one aside? Could I have it a little bit longer, please?
Sure.
Just one, forgive me. Let me find it. Okay. One thing that has come up a lot.
Okay, and I want to show you this too.
Okay.
We were successful, we meaning the Ukrainian American community, and I was very much involved with this, in being able to convince the U.S. Congress to fund research on the Holodomor. At that time, it was called the Ukrainian famine. And this was research that was done. I was a member of the commission, which included congressmen, members of the legislative branch, of course, Congress, the executive branch as well, and public members. And I was a public member of this organization, which did research, and basically what I have done for you is to develop this. My wife is going upstairs, and I'm going to let you have this.
Wow. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you.
This is something that I wrote. It's a teacher's guide, and what we've been doing for the last few years is, we're going around from school to school, and we were able to convince the state of Illinois to include the Holodomor as part of genocide studies in the public schools. Objecting, of course, were the radical Jews who said, you can't call it a genocide, there's only one genocide that's ever existed, and that's the Holocaust. Okay, so to get back...
Wait.
Okay.
Yeah. Could this issue? There's an issue here. There's a million issues here. I've spoken to Jewish individuals, and I read there are a number of Jewish individuals who object to anybody else using the term the Holocaust. It comes up. There's a guy who did the American Holocaust about the American Indians. They were all angry about that. Richard Lucas, I interviewed about. He called his book "The Forgotten Holocaust." Could you could you discuss that? A lot of people in the Jewish community get angry about that.
Oh yeah, they do. The thing is, a friend of mine, Bogdan Vitvitsky, he had to change his name to Vitvitsky instead of Witwitsky. He has a doctorate in history. He never could get a job after he wrote this, so he went back to school. He became a lawyer. And he wrote this book called The Other Holocaust, where he wrote about the fact that in the Holocaust there were many people besides the Jews who died. He wrote about the Gypsies, he wrote about the Ukrainians, he wrote about the Poles, and he was pilloried by the Jewish community. And even though he did an honest historian's research piece, and he was pilloried. Jews, not all Jews. Again, when I say the Jews, I don't mean all Jews, okay? That has to be understood, because most Jews are, like most Americans, are not even aware of OSI or any of this, okay? And as an aside, as a sidebar, I learned this when I was working with David Roth. David Roth took me to a fundraiser, and he says, look, Myron, you have to understand that not all Jews are like all Jews. He said, basically, what we do, we have fundraiser, and we will have a fundraiser, and we will invite people, and they will come, and, we'll raise millions of dollars. But most Jews don't want to get involved. Like, I mean, it's natural human nature. They don't want to get involved with the ADL, with the AJC, or any of these organizations, but they donate. And what they'll do is they will say to somebody, will say, Eli, look, here's the deal. We put you down for $5,000 this year. Now, Eli says, Eli, you don't have to come to any meetings. We won't bother you for the rest of the year. No mailings, nothing. Just write out a check for $5,000. He says, you promise me no mailings, no phone calls, nothing? Right, okay, here's the check. Leave me alone. And that's the way they like it, okay? Now, that's most Jews. And that's what my friend David Roth told me. It's like most Ukrainians, most Poles and everyone. Not all Ukrainians are into all of this stuff. They're not, okay? I mean, they have other things to do with their lives. But most Ukrainians do get upset when they're called Russians. Most Ukrainians get very upset when they're called the Ukraine. Now, why the Ukraine? We fought that like crazy. You know why? Because when those Russian professors that I told you about came here, they introduced the term the Ukraine. Ukraine has two meanings. One is the border. The other is nation. Ukraina to us means nation. But krai by itself has meaning of nation. Like we would say, for example, stari kraj, which means the old country.
It's Polish also.
Yeah.
Very, very close language. Huh?
Right, they are. Or it means edge. Kraj. Ja stał na kraju. I was standing on the edge, okay? Now, when they introduced the Ukraine, that was that was done for a reason. Because if you say the Ukraine, you mean part of a greater whole, all right? Like you say the Yukon, all right? It's part of a greater whole. So for years, we were fighting. And even today, some newspapers still write, when they write about Ukraine, they'll say the Ukraine, all right? And that just drives us nuts. Anyway, we used to fight that as an issue. But to get back to the Holodomor, they had all of these leftists from the 1930s who were covering up, led by Walter Duranty. Now, as a woman who wrote a book about him, she was a leftist. She started to write a book about him because she thought he was a great correspondent. By the time she got finished writing the book, she had totally changed her mind and wrote a book about, in fact, she called him Stalin's Apologist, the life of Walter Duranty. All right, that's the name of the book. So you have a situation where we had the cover-up. The Soviets have said that the famine never happened. It was never planned. I mean, the famine, there was, yes, there were people who were dying of malnutrition, but it wasn't due to any plan. And even today, the Russians just get very upset if you mention the Holodomor because it reflects badly on Russia. Nothing has changed, basically, there. I mean, it's all still the Soviet mindset.
What about the controversial aspect of the Jewish angle to this, the Holodomor, the representation in the Soviets? That you've got in trouble for that. So have other people.
Well,
what's the issues at stake in that?
Okay, you must know that David Roth, the American Jewish Committee, supported us and testified on behalf of this sitting right next to me. Okay, so that's one person. The Jewish establishment, okay, does not want anybody to talk about the Holodomor as a genocide. You can call it a famine, you can call it the Armenian massacre, you can call all the other genocides anything you want, but don't call them a genocide because there is only one genocide, and that is the Holocaust, okay? Or they have another name for it, they call it the Shoah as well, all right?
I can't find the other one.
what other one? Okay,
The photo.
all right. I just wanted the empty folder, sweetheart.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
okay.
But I put that.
Yeah, okay, that's
I put
good.
that in there because
Okay, this is the
That's-
old version. I have the newest version right over there behind you.
what?
I have the newest version right, no, here's the newest version, sorry. Okay, so I will give you this and the photo gallery that goes with
Yeah.
All right,
this.
thank you, okay.
Yeah.
I'm making out like a bandit here.
So there it is. Now,
Okay.
now this is way back when we called it the forced famine. Now we call it
Yeah.
Holodomor,
Yes.
which means death by hunger.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And could you address further, again, the Jewish community has the Holocaust, and I've interviewed two gypsies, Roma, on the Holocaust, and they're, both of those guys are really, to this day, upset about how they were treated.
Yeah.
How their suffering is elevated, or not elevated, is pushed down. The Poles have their version of events, and and there's the Jewish Holocaust is at the top, and everybody else is suffering
Right.
is another tier. Could you address that?
Okay, one section of the Jewish establishment uses the Holocaust as a vehicle for support for the state of Israel. You know, we will never survive as a people unless we have an independent nation, and you know, here we are, and this is what happened to us. Now, they also use it to beat people over the head with, you know, every time that you mention something that Israel does that you don't like, you're an anti-Semite. And then one step after that is,
You may have
Are
only
you-
one left. But that's it. I wanted to show that we had. This is North Dakota, right?
yeah, North Dakota.
See?
Ah.
Look at how far back.
Yeah, and obscure places too.
Yeah.
Yes. So, this is, I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is what Myron was, put together, a picture, a history for the museum,
Okay.
and then wrote the whole history of it.
Okay, I'll take a
But it-
glance at that in a little bit.
Yeah, but I think that may be the last
Well,
one.
okay, we're gonna have to order
Yeah.
some of those.
Yeah. And,
Okay, to get back
Yeah.
to
Well,
the,
could you finish up there? You talk
Yeah.
about being beat on the head by the Holocaust. You're talking about people. You're talking about how it's used to support Israel
yeah,
and how other things.
you know, and first they use the Holocaust. Okay, you know, beat you over the head. If you criticize anything that the Jews do here or anything that is done by Israel, okay. And then the next step is, are you a Holocaust denier? You know, which is the next thing. Now, when it comes to the Holodomor, there was a wonderful book written very recently by a professor at Yale University called Bloodlines. And what it did was to write about the Holocaust and the Holodomor. And if you read it line for line and read between the lines, the suggestion is that the Holodomor was as bad as the Holocaust, if not worse. Every Jewish critic of the book has said that this is the sin of equivalency, that you can't equate anything else to the Jewish Holocaust. In a way, they're right, because the Holocaust was the singling out of one group for mass murder, okay. But they weren't the only group. So were the Ukrainians. We were the Untermensch. Hitler said that the Ukrainians are fit for nothing past the 4th grade of education. And they're like, so the Holocaust is the elephant in the room in any discussion that I have ever had with the Jews about anything. It's always, don't you realize, or you've got to realize, or you've got to understand. This is every sentence that they utter begins with that. You've got to understand how the Jews suffered, okay? And if you don't understand that, then, but even if you say, I do understand, they say, but you really don't. You really don't. And then I would hit them back with, do you? I said, were you there? You weren't there. Well, I know, but what I read, I said, so did I read about it. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible catastrophe for the Jewish people, but the Holodomor is a table, So finally, I don't discuss it with them anymore. Because with that element of the Jewish establishment that uses the Holocaust as a weapon or as a way to make you feel second rate, you're not going to convince them. Because even if in their heart of hearts they believed you, they could not admit it.
I've heard some arguments also that, traditionally the Jewish community has a sense of superiority, is chosen by God and all that, and that the Holocaust has a religious aspect too. And that they really cling on to this thing as like, it's really important that they be the supreme sufferers. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have run into that, but I mean, I don't think that that's the main issue. I mean, the main issue for them is that it's a political weapon, which they use time and time again when it's to their advantage, okay? They will use it as a weapon in order to win an argument with you.
Okay, and I've heard there's a controversial trial or investigation or something in Ukraine about individuals who helped perpetrate the Holodomor and the Jewishness of that. There's some Jews in that. Do you have any knowledge?
No, they were never. I personally don't think there will ever be there is no trial now, and in my opinion, there will never be a trial because the Jewish international community would be up in arms. And what they will do, I will give you an example of how they tried to portray, as soon as Ukraine became independent, the CBS had a 60-minute piece led by Morley Safer, a Jew, in which they said that the Jews of Lvov, now this is after I went to Ukraine, okay? The Jews, I wrote this, okay? And I took apart the whole argument that they had that the Jews have a reason to be fearful of Ukrainians. Morley Safer, for example, in here says right off the bat, the Jews of Lvov have reason to be concerned. These are the kinds of scenes they've been seeing lately. What they had, for example, this word, Slava Nazia. Slava Nazii, okay? Now, nobody bothered to translate that. In Ukrainian, it means glory to the nation. But if you look at that word, what does it look like? Nazi, right? Now, if you heard that, if you were walking in a street in Ukraine and you saw a group of people standing there with their hand up like this going, Slava Nazi, Slava Nazi, you'd say, oh my God, what do we have here? We have Nazis. And that's what Morley Safer did with this scurrilous piece of reporting, all right? But nothing ever happened to Morley Safer or anybody else. They can get away with this stuff.
What about this? So supposedly there's the Jewish community I saw online was up in arms because there was going to be some sort of investigation of the Holodomor and that there were Jewish individuals who were working in the Soviet apparatus. They were worried about anti-Semitism. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't.
Okay, well, then maybe that came.
But I could see what they should be, because way out of proportion to their percentage in the population, there were more Jews in the KGB and KVD and Lenacheka than any other group. This is not to say that there weren't also Ukrainians involved in KGB. There were. But way out of proportion to the population. The Jews were involved. My sense of it is they wanted to be involved. They wanted to maybe not consciously, but certainly unconsciously, they wanted revenge against the Ukrainians. And the Soviet Union offered them an opportunity, and especially in the secret police.
So is this part of the popular Ukrainian perception of Jewish history in the Soviet Union? Is that
See, but if you say that, then they'll say, are you a follower of Adolf Hitler? Because that's what Hitler said. You know, Hitler said Judeo-Bolshevism. You know, this is what he said. So you don't talk about this, you know. We don't. That may be the perception of many people, but you won't hear it.
So then, what about the implicit censorship about all this stuff? Which is to say, there are so many things, because of the fear of anti-Semitism, the charge against you or anybody, the fear of being attacked as a bigot, the fear, and all that people cannot go into historical realms and do legitimate investigation. Not just the Ukrainian community, but but to you, I asked the Ukrainian community. What about this issue?
Well, this is what happened. I have to tell you the story. The Ukrainians were aware of this, that they had no access to the academic world, okay? So, a student organization said, you know what? We've been moaning and groaning about the fact that, you know, why don't we create a chair of Ukrainian studies? Wouldn't that be wonderful? And the Ukrainian community said, wonderful, yes, right. How much do you need? $1 million for openers, okay? So we will find $1 million. We raised $1 million over many years. Finally had a chair of Ukrainian studies. Problem was, you know, Harvard said, well, there are no PhDs in Ukrainian studies. And we said, well, we know that because there were no Ukrainian studies in the United States. Well, then we have to appoint. We will decide who's going to be the head of the Ukrainian studies. And we said, then we want a professor from Harvard. And he said, well, do you have one here at Harvard? And he said, yes. He's a Turkology professor. But he's also a professor. He's a PhD. So he became the head of that. Then they got their own PhDs. They finally, a number of them finished the PhD. You know who heads up the chair of the Ukrainian Studies Department at Harvard, which our community has paid for? A Jew. Flyer is his name. F-L-I-E-R. And if we say anything, what do you think the charge will be? What are you guys, anti-Semites? He's a professor of Slavic languages. We said, maybe if we get somebody, they will correct the historical record and they will do studies. Well, have they done historical studies? Yes. But it's everything up through the 17th century. No modern Ukrainian history. All right? Now, there have been people who received their PhDs from there who have written after they left Harvard. They were not hired by Harvard, but they went up to Canada. And we have PhDs in Ukrainian studies that can't find a job in America, in the United States, so they have to go up to Canada.
There's a lot of issues to this. What about your sense of Jewish communities' power to tell their story? Like the Poles have no power, Ukrainians have no power, the Gypsies have no power. And I interviewed a professor of Jewish studies, Jewish guy, Mark Ellis at Baylor University. He's the head of the department, a very interesting guy. And he was frank about Jewish wealth, and he was frank about there's an implicit bias in the teaching of all this. What's your sense of all this?
There's a book I have downstairs called Jewish Power. The Jews, the Jewish, what's the name of their organization? The Jewish Welfare or something. It's an umbrella organization of all the Jewish charities. They raise more money every year, this guy writes, and I can show you the quote, than the American Red Cross. So you want to talk about power? They've got power. They've got academic power. The thing that I give to the Jews is, A, they're very bright, most of them. I've met some very stupid Jews. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're all very bright. But for the most part, A. B, they emphasize education, okay? and self-discipline. And in order to do that, it's like we're alone, we have no friends in the world, so, you know, in order to survive, we have to be very bright. And C, they're wealthy. They are incredibly wealthy because of the fact that in the old country, they were not allowed to own land. In the Jewish Pale of Settlement, they were not allowed to own land. In the Russian Empire, they were not allowed to. So they had to hustle. And in order to hustle, they had to become businessmen. And in our mindset, in the Ukrainian agricultural mindset, it was all about land. I'm a farmer. If I have 20 acres of land, I'm a rich man. The Jews couldn't own land, so land was not an issue with them. It was survival through business. And they have a history of being entrepreneurial. And they brought that with them here. So did the Lebanese. The richest ethnic group in the United States are the Lebanese. The second one are the Armenians on a per capita basis, okay? And the third are the Jewish. All of them have an entrepreneurial history. Ukrainians, Poles, Slovaks, and Czechs, they have no entrepreneurial history. You know, I mean, they're all farmers, the land. My dad, all of his life, he worked, he had his own service station, okay? All of his life, he was saving money to buy real estate, to buy land, okay? And he did very well, okay? But it was in the back of his mind. He didn't create a business, as Jews ever want to do, but he worked as a service station manager and did very, very well.
So how does all this impact then this power, impact the telling of of Ukrainian history? How does that? There's an enormous disbalance, and the fact that this guy at Harvard, who's a Jewish guy,
Yeah.
strikes me as profound. It's a profound issue because, you know, you won't find hardly. I'm sure if you go through all the lists of the Jewish Studies Department in America, there could be someone who's not Jewish there, but I think it'd probably be infinitesimally small. And could you discuss this?
Well, okay. I don't think that's unusual, frankly. I mean, it's not something that makes me happy, but if you look at any profession in the world, whether it's entertainment or medicine or science, literature, among the top 10 people in the world, at least one or two are Jews, okay? Far out of proportion to their percentage in the world population. It's just the way it is. It's for all those reasons that I mentioned, that they, from childhood, they emphasize education. Education, learn and study and learn how to get on in the world, okay? So, am I upset that Harvard let this Jew in? Yes. Would I have liked for the Ukrainians to say something about it? Yes. Will they? No. Why? Because they're afraid. They don't want to be called anti-Semite. And they say, well, he's got the credentials. No, he doesn't. He's not an historian, okay, number one. Number two, he's a linguist, and he knows Slavic languages. Does he care about Ukrainian language? Does he care about the Ukrainian image? Probably not. Does he care about his job? No. Has he ever spoken to Ukrainians outside of the Boston area? Not that I'm aware of. You know. Does he have to worry about his future? No.
Well, the paradox, from my studies and what I've done, it seems that most Jewish Studies Department, whoever runs it, is an activist for Jewish issues.
Of course.
I mean,
that's what it's all about.
Yeah, so, and if this Harvard position, he can't.
All right. Let me ask you a question. Will you ever find a head of a Holocaust Studies department at any university in the world who's a Ukrainian? Never. Yeah, you have it, you know.
Are there any other Ukrainian studies professors in America, or is the Harvard one the only position, or what's the deal?
That is the only chair. Actually, there are now a chair of history, a chair of literature, and a chair of the Ukrainian language. And overall, over all of them is this guy, Dr. Flyer.
What do you mean over all of them? Is
Well,
there
I mean,
support?
they're all part of the Ukrainian Studies Center. They're all part of that. The Harvard Ukrainian Studies Center, and he's the head of that.
So
He's a linguist, though.
and he's in a position then to screen out whatever he would determine or think to be anti-Semitism.
Well, yeah,
I mean the politic of that.
in theory, yes. Willie, I don't think it'll ever come up. I don't think that anybody who is working on a doctorate would dare write anything in history in a doctoral dissertation that in any way suggested anti-Semitism.
Or even not even just being critical of the Jewish community.
No.
I'm finding it's a taboo.
It is.
Whether you're in Poland or Ukraine or in the Middle East, you can't without getting heat.
Getting heat.
Could you elaborate on that? Do you have any thoughts?
I can show you my wounds. You want to see those?
Okay, well, yeah.
I mean, what's to elaborate? I mean, there's nothing to elaborate. The fact of the matter is they do have the power, and they use it. Did they use it wisely for their own ends? Yes. Are they making friends? No. Excuse me.
Can we segue into you have been really defamed. I mean, I heard about you on the internet. I mean, I had the quotes. Rahm Emanuel came head first for you.
Yeah.
How on earth and I read what you've written on the internet. I don't see what
Well,
the big deal is.
okay, what it was that the head, I can't prove this, but what I believe, I'm sure Rahm Emanuel doesn't read the Ukrainian Weekly. I mean, nor does any other Jewish congressman, okay? But I know who doesn't read the Ukrainian Weekly. It's Eli Rosenbaum of OSI. He reads the Ukrainian Weekly. He keeps, or his people do, okay? They keep a tab on all of the ethnic press, especially the Eastern European ethnic press, the Polish press, the Ukrainian press, the Lithuanian, Baltic, Estonians, a Latvians, and they keep their eyes peeled on this, okay, for any hint. Now, Eli Rosenbaum and I had a debate in the Ukrainian Weekly. Now, no Jewish paper would ever print anything that I've written, okay? But the Ukrainian Weekly, being open, allowed him to respond to one of my columns. And I came back and I skewered him. At least I thought I did. I told him, that he's a Ukrainophobe because he suggested I was an anti-Semite. Well, that was the end of me, all right? Because he gave all of this information, I am absolutely certain, can't prove it, to these congressmen. When President George W. Bush made me a member of the American delegation to the inauguration of President Yushchenko, okay? Why me? Major reason was that I'm a visible Ukrainian Republican and have been for years. Worked in the White House for Gerald Ford, was the special assistant for ethnic affairs. So I have a track record, okay. So I worked for George W. Bush. So when the time came to appoint an American delegation, headed by the Secretary of State, Powell, they called me up and they said, would you like to be a member of it? I said, are you kidding me? Of course. Well, I no sooner got on that plane when Eli made a phone call to all of the Jewish congressmen and said, hey, you know what? Now all Democrats, of course. So it was a twofer. Number one, they're going to be able to hit a Ukrainian. Number two, they're going to be able to hit a Republican president, all right? Why not? Why wouldn't they go for it? So Rahm Emanuel, the first thing he did, after he did that, local newspaper right away had wanted to come and say, well, we want to give you an opportunity for your side. And basically it started out, you know, with the question, are you sure, or it wasn't quite phrased that way, but it was almost to the point, are you sure you're not an anti-Semite? You know, so I had to prove that I was not an anti-Semite, rather than somebody had to prove that I am an anti-Semite. So I'm always on the defensive, you know. Or how can you show us that you're really not an anti-Semite? So when I showed them this plaque that I have, and they said, oh, that's interesting, and they moved on from there.
And they did what?
Well, they moved on with the next question was, yeah, but what about this that you wrote? And what about this? I said, where did you get that? Well, hold on, you know.
Has that been put away, or that
Yeah,
that
it's
plaque?
this thing here. Oh, yeah, no,
plaque.
it's upstairs.
Oh, I wanted to get a shot of that.
Oh.
We'll get it later. Let me write
Okay.
that down. Shot of plaque.
I'd like you want us to look at the plaque, yeah.
So this story
thought we were
goes
done.
on and on. I mean, you have how did this snowball more? Then you have I found this congressman, Jewish, Nadler in New York, blasted the Bush administration for appointing you're an open anti-Semite.
Open
Could you
anti-Semite.
discuss what's going on? Oh, and here you're called in this article, quote, one of this country's most vocal anti-Semites.
Vocal, one of the most yeah.
Could you discuss
here I am.
how does
Yeah.
this happen? How does
Well, it snowballs. You know, this is the thing. They play on each other. They wanted to get after George W. Bush, the Democrats, okay? And in my opinion, Democrats will say anything that they believe needs to be said against a Republican and will hurt them in some way. The New York Times called me immediately and said, are you an anti-Semite? I said, no.
Walking in the house.
Just returning from
the
Ukraine.
flight, I picked up the phone. It was the Chicago Tribune. And I thought they were going to ask him. They knew that he went there. How was the trip? And I no knowledge of what was going to transpire. And all of a sudden I see his facial demeanor, and it just dropped. And he just walked in. And
Well,
they handed him the
let me
phone.
wire you up later on and to have this, because I can't hear you on the tape on this.
Yeah, okay,
But
let's
so
shoot.
we'll get back to that. I want to have you make a few comments, say it, okay?
Okay.
Please?
Okay, you can ask her, what does it feel to be, no, how does it feel to be the wife of an anti-Semite?
But you were even called, Rahm Emanuel called you dangerous.
I am dangerous. Here I am, you know. Here I am in DeKalb, a dangerous anti-Semite. But you know why I'm dangerous? Because at the time I was teaching at Northern Illinois University. And Rahm Emanuel demanded from John Peters, the president of the university, that I be immediately fired. Because he is a dangerous anti-Semite, must be removed from a public university. And so the next thing I had to do, I went over to the department chair, and she was already on the phone with, the Tribune. And she says, Myron, have a seat. And she said, I want you to hear what I'm going to tell him. And she told him, right in my presence, she said, look, I don't know anything about it. I know for a fact that he teaches the history of American education. I've never, in all the 20 years that he's been teaching here, heard anything that would even remotely suggest that he's an anti-Semite. So I know nothing about it. But thank you for asking. Then she hung up. Then they asked President Peters, are you going to fire him? And he said, absolutely not, because as far as he called the department chair, what about Myron Kuropas? And she said, he's fine, we know anything about it. So Peters, to his credit, did not succumb to the Jewish pressure, which was incredible. But what I really think happened behind the scenes, because I have a relatively good reputation among the Jews in this town, because they had him over the house to meet Yaakov Suslinski. And an anti-Semite wouldn't do that, okay? But I heard from one of them that, Myron, you know, we had a big discussion via the internet about what we should do. Should we take a stand? And the dean of the graduate school at that time, Dean Czar, said, let's stay out of it totally. And they did. They did not take a stand.
Okay.
To their credit, because I'm sure that they were under, you know.
So in your evaluation, what is all this about? Why? I mean,
It's all
I
about
get-
OSI. OSI. I mean, all of this stuff about my being an anti-Semite never would have happened had it not been for Eli Rosenbaum, in my opinion. Because I can't imagine that any of these congressmen from New York, California, any of those places, read the Ukrainian Weekly. And not by the wildest imagination, why would they be reading the Ukrainian Weekly? You know, I mean, they have more important things to worry about, the budget, other things like that.
okay, and so all these problems stem from this one article that you wrote, right?
No, they were.
Or how did
It
this
was the ongoing dialogue that I had about OSI, about articles that I've written about OSI. Okay, but the tipping point was the article that I wrote, a review of the Finkelstein book. Okay, that's the one, and that's this article here, where at the end I basically say that they're going to be looking to Ukraine for reparations. Well, here's what I wrote right at the end. I said, big money drives the Holocaust industry. Former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleberger earns $300,000 per year as chairman of a Holocaust claims organization. Rabbi Marvin Heyer, dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, has his wife and son on the center payroll. Their combined family income 5 years ago was $520,000. Simon Wiesenthal himself commands $25,000 per appearance. World Jewish Congress President Brafman claims that his organization has amassed roughly $7 billion in compensation monies. Last paragraph. To survive, the Holocaust industry is always searching for its next mark. Ukraine's turn is just around the corner. And I believe that. As soon as Ukraine is going to be on its feet, I believe that they are going to be going after Ukraine for all of the crimes done against the Jewish people in Ukraine.
Okay, now, so what is the logic that you're an anti-Semite from that? In your view, how on earth do you get to anti-Semite from that?
You don't need anything more than that. What logic? You need logic? It's all emotional. Okay. They subconsciously understand that I am in the Ukrainian DNA lives anti-Semitism. A Ukrainian, by definition, is an anti-Semite.
I talked with somebody. Somebody told me, it might have been you when I met you briefly before, that the Jewish community sort of teaches hate. About was that you or someone else? Or
No, that was me.
could you discuss that? Whether it's Ukrainians or Poles or whatever, could you discuss that?
Well, as I started out in this interview, this psychologist that I was working with when I was a school counselor, okay, knew about the Ukrainians because he later told me, he says, well, I learned about the Ukrainians in the Jewish schools. They learned about Khmelnytsky and Petlura and Hitler. And they wanted to tag on Demjanjuk. This is what I believe, okay? And so, although I don't have any concrete proof, okay, but I am doing research on it. I can't get a hold of a Jewish textbook used in their Friday night schools, okay? I can't, but I will eventually because I know it's out there because Jews have told me this, okay? And they have said, look, he says, everything that I ever learned about the Ukrainians was negative. We had a study done by, in fact, it's in this book, which I'm going to let you have. Okay, in this book, the UNA had a study done by a Marilyn Olson, okay? And in the study, okay, here it is. In August 1985, the UNA, the Ukrainian National Association, Heritage Defense Committee asked the National Center for Urban Ethnic Affairs to prepare a review of Jewish American press articles on Ukrainians. The report, titled An Analysis of the Treatment of Ukraine and Ukrainians in Jewish Currents, which is a top Jewish publication, was written by Carolyn Olson, and it was completed in 1986. Here's what she concluded. Almost all the references to Ukrainians that were made were of an unflattering nature. Most, in fact, were unremittingly harsh. Ukrainians are portrayed as strongly anti-Semitic with a history of violence against Jews. They were also seen as collaborators with the Nazis and supporters of authoritarian, racist, or fascist ideologies in Europe and the West. Ukrainian nationalism, which many Ukrainian Americans regard as positive, depicting a cause favoring independence for Ukraine and a rejection of communism, has negative connotations to Jewish Americans. Thus, a Jewish American reader of a major publication such as Jewish Currents over the past 2 decades would, on the basis of the images and information presented to him or her in its pages, be likely to have a decidedly unfriendly and suspicious attitude to Ukrainians and an impression of Ukrainian history as an experience of violence and hostility for Jews unless mitigated or offset by personal context or other data. In fact, he or she would have been explicitly warned on one occasion by the magazine to be suspicious of what is interpreted to be overtures for better relations from the Ukrainian side. That's amazing.
So can you summarize the systemic negativity towards Ukrainians, just generally on the fly? Just summarize the essence of what you just read,
Well,
in your view.
well, the essence is, if the Jewish Currents, which is a top Jewish American publication, is an indication of what Jews read about Ukrainians, then they can only have a negative point of view. And by extrapolation from that, I have to think that it doesn't start with the Jewish Currents. It is part and parcel of other Jewish newspapers. As an example was that meeting we had with the editor of the Chicago Jewish newspaper, who looked at Yakoslav Suslinski and said, how can you have anything to do with these people over here? Okay. I would think that it starts from an early age. It's not something that pops up recently, okay? I would be willing to bet that if you walked up to the average educated Jew, by educated meaning someone who is in touch with his Jewish heritage, who went to a Jewish school, okay, and ask him, what do you think of the Ukrainians? The answer would be fascist, Nazi, anti-Semite. I can't prove that. I haven't done that survey, but she did.
This is very, out of this little book here, let me hit you with this, going back a little bit further. This is a quote. And basically, it's a long quote. I'm going to just read an excerpt, but it says, so for various reasons, so many Jews, the Ukrainian conjures up a fascinating package of images. Peasant, drunkard, barbarian, a creature prone to excess and lacking both culture and civility, a fierce, threatening figure when he is angered or given to his passions. Now, that is exactly the stereotype Jews have of Poles.
Yeah.
And I interviewed a professor, a Jewish professor at Hebrew Union College called Jonathan Krasner, who did a study about that. He was very frank with me. So what about that?
Well, okay, so look, if we understand the early history, okay, the Jews were a marginalized people in Ukraine and in Poland. They lived by themselves in the shtetls. They were surrounded by peasants. They were surrounded by people who were oppressed by the people in charge, okay, whether it's the Russians or the Poles, okay, at the time. And so, yes, they were more given to drinking than the Jews. Were they drunks? Yes. Were all of them drunks? No. But the stereotype emerged, okay? Who was involved with the pogroms? The drunken Ukrainians, who were pushed by the Russians, okay? The Russians were the ones who organized the pogroms. The pogroms could not have happened without the blessing of the Russian Tsarist police, okay? They did that. Now, what happened, for example, I'll give you an example to what happened in Lviv. Hitler and Stalin divide Ukraine, all right? And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. Hitler invades Poland from the west. Stalin invades Poland from the east, okay? We know what happened in Poland under Hitler. We don't know, a few Americans know what happened in western or eastern Poland or western Ukraine. Stalin invades and immediately he Sovietizes. The year and a half or almost 2 years that the Soviets were in charge of Western Ukraine, formerly Eastern Poland, they arrested all the national leaders, they arrested the teachers, they arrested all the intelligentsia of Western Ukraine, and they were in jail. Suddenly, Germans invade. They smash into the Soviet Union, and within days they're in Lviv, which is the largest city in Western Ukraine. The Soviets did not have enough time to take all the prisoners that they had arrested, so they murdered them all, every single one of them that were in the jails, thousands. All right? Murdered them right there and left. The Germans, realizing that this is an opportunity to fire up all the locals, opened up the prisons and let the Ukrainians go in there and look for their relatives. The Ukrainians went in, all right? Now, most of the people who welcomed the Soviets when they marched into Western Ukraine were Jews. Jews went from house to house and identified where the Ukrainian nationalists lived. Identified them and helped the Russians, the Soviets, to arrest them. So, you have all of these people finding their relatives in there, looking at this horror that was perpetrated by the Soviets. And the Germans said, see what the Judeo-Bolsheviks have done to your people. Remember that the Ukrainians welcomed the Germans into the Soviet Union because they thought anybody was better than Stalin. And so they welcomed them in. So what did they do? They went and helped the Germans find the Jews to pay them back for what they believed that the Jews had done to them. And the Jews went and were murdered by the Germans and the Ukrainians who participated. Not all Ukrainians, but some. Okay, what I wanted to show you was this.
Could you discuss this a little bit too again, please?
Yeah, this goes back to many, many years when we were
Okay, but could you have it facing me? I need, yeah, okay, and what
Okay.
exactly are we looking at here?
Okay, we're looking at an American Jewish Committee Certificate of Appreciation. And I'll read it to you. It says, for recognizing and respecting diversity of all groups within our society, for helping to bring these groups together, for the betterment of all mankind, for working together and responding to the needs of these diverse groups, for helping forge links among all groups, knowing that each group has an important place in a pluralistic society. The American Jewish Committee does hereby present the Certificate of Appreciation on the 10th day of September 1979 on the occasion of the Midwest Regional Conference, the American Jewish Committee. All right? Now this was after I was in the White House, after I'd worked with the Jews in the White House, after I organized the Jewish American Conference in the White House, okay? I received this certificate from them.
Could you explain then how on earth did you become this dangerous anti-Semite after getting this?
I wish I knew. I don't know. Bless you.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, honey.
it's all right. I'm
Would-
listening to you.
Okay, would you be nice enough to give me some water with a lemon?
Sure.
Thank you.
Happy to.
It all started, David Roth and I, as I mentioned, we were we were good friends. And as I began to write about Demjanjuk, about OSI, he would call me up, right? Let's you remember when David Roth used to call me?
Yeah.
And he said, Myron, I read what you wrote in the Ukrainian Weekly. And I said, yeah. He said, I like you as a friend, you're a friend and everything, but, you've got to remember that I work for the American Jewish Committee. I said, I know, David. He says,
In fact, if I can add this,
yeah,
he said if there were a time when I would need, if anything happened to me, and I needed, and my child was still a minor, and I needed somebody to take care of her.
if I died, he said
If
to
I
me,
died,
in my
I
wife's
would
presence.
want you to take care of her.
Okay. He knew that I would raise this child as a Jew.
Yeah,
I mean, that's how
yeah,
close David Roth and I were at that one time. So anyway, when did this change? He would call me and say, but there are others who don't understand. So see if you can just tone it down a little bit. I said, David, I can't do that. Is there anything that I'm writing that's not true or that you don't think is true? Well, he'd never say it's not true. But what happened was that gradually, but especially after he died in 1995, and Eli Rosenbaum became the head of OSI, that he began to follow what I write in the weekly. And he wouldn't warn me. He would just, he would write to the Ukrainian Weekly.
Okay, can I ask you this? This is a recent, I don't know if you know anything about this or not, but maybe there have been three elements in recent history that Jewish community has said, they're monitoring because it could cause anti-Semitism. It's Russian-based, some of this, but I wonder to what degree it affected the Ukraine. And one is the so-called Russian oligarchs, who are mostly Jewish. I don't know if and that there's all kinds of troubles after the fall of communism. These Jewish guys, 6 or 7 of the top ones were Jewish and took over and all this. Then there's the Russian mafia, which the Jewish guy Robert Friedman wrote a book called The Red Mafia.
I have
it's mostly
that.
Jewish.
Yeah, I have that.
And then there's this Israeli sex trade, which affects Ukraine directly.
Yeah.
The New York Times had a big article. Those three elements, in terms of anti-Semitism, do you have any speculations or thoughts about any of those things?
No, but no, I don't. I really don't. It makes me angry that, look, first of all, I know that the Jews who moved to Israel as they were fleeing from the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union finally said, okay, you can go, so they moved to Israel. Many of them are returning to Ukraine because they now have money, and Ukraine is an opportunity. And they're entrepreneurs. So they have entrepreneurial experience that most Ukrainians do not have. For two reasons. They're an agricultural people, or were, and in the Soviet Union, you weren't an entrepreneur because it was not something that you were allowed to do. So they are returning. I do know that in Ukraine, many of the oligarchs are Jews. And this is the hypocrisy. And that makes me so angry. That Jews lived well, for the most part, up until the last few years of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, as compared to the Ukrainians. The Jews lived well in the post-Soviet era because many of the oligarchs were in positions of power, and they stole, along with the Ukrainians along with them, and they became oligarchs, okay? And yet every time you talk about Ukrainian, like in this here, CBS, I don't know exact date of this, but I can tell you right away. 1994. The name of the CBS thing was The Ugly Face of Freedom. All about Ukrainian independence. Terrible thing for Jews. Jews are really in trouble. Jews are going to be in jail. Oh my goodness. While this was going on, they were stealing. And they were becoming multi-billionaires. The richest person in Ukraine is a Jew. Okay? Do I resent that? I do. Not because he's a Jew, but because he's a thief. And I resent all the oligarchs, Jewish, Ukrainian, and Russian, who have stolen in Ukraine and become multi-billionaires. Most of the people in the Ukrainian parliament are millionaires. Millionaires. They buy their votes. It is a corrupt country. Under the present president, it is becoming increasingly more corrupt. And behind it all are many Jews, many Russians, and many of my own people. And I dislike them all, okay? But dare I say that oligarch is a Jew? Blah. Dare I say that oligarch is a Ukrainian? Oh, that's okay. No, you can say that. No, but don't mention that this guy's a Jew.
The Russian mafia, any knowledge about that? Does that affect Ukraine, the Jewish thing?
Well, other than the fact that they have used young Ukrainian girls, sent them over here, and started up the prostitution rings out of Brighton Park, down in New York.
And is that controversial in Ukraine, or do people know about this issue?
They do, but it's not.
Anti-Semitism undergirding this. Is that a factor at all?
No.
People don't even care that they're Jews behind the Red Mafia?
No, they don't. They don't.
Okay. Those are sensational stories, all those. I mean, when I read those things, I went, whoa. You had talked to me before the controversies over a Holocaust museum in Winnipeg. Could you discuss that?
Yeah, I have a person that you need to email. He's in the middle of this whole thing. Well, what I'll do, I wrote a column on it. In fact, my last one in the Ukrainian Weekly was called Canadian Capers. And it's about just that issue. A Jewish multimillionaire in Winnipeg decided that it would be a good thing for there to be a human rights museum in Winnipeg. Winnipeg is, pretty much in the center of the country. And he thought it would be a good thing. And there would be two groups that would have primary exposure, one the Jews, and the other the natives of Canada, Indians, you know, and those. And the Ukrainians, who are as well organized up in Canada, and pretty much the same number as the Jews, and with some far more political influence than we here in the United States, said, well, you know, I mean, it's all very nice, but what about, you know, the Holodomor? And the Jews initially said, yeah, well, okay, yeah, you know, we have no problem. And as time went on, the Ukrainians learned that the Jews had nothing more in mind for them than maybe an exhibit once a year, something like that, but no permanent exhibit. Okay. So my friend, his name is